If your name happens to be Richard Parker, then you might want to keep your feet on dry land. And I say that because in the following four examples, two from history and two from literature, the nautical adventures of sailors named Richard Parker ended in suffering and disaster. In December 1793, Richard Parker, a midshipman in the British Navy with an apparently promising career, refused to put away his hammock after being ordered to do so. He was court-martialed and subsequently discharged from the Navy for his refusal. Unable to find work, he was eventually thrown into prison for not paying his outstanding debts. With no other way to pay bills, Parker reluctantly again joined the Navy and was serving on the HMS Sandwich when the Nore mutiny began on May 12, 1797. The name the Nore referred to the site of a Royal Navy anchorage in the Thames estuary. The Nore mutiny occurred because sailors were displeased with conditions on ships, wanted higher pay, and for the Navy to end the practice of impressment, among other things. In fact, conditions aboard the HMS Sandwich, a 90-gun second-rate ship of the line, were notoriously amongst the worst in the fleet. Parker had not participated in the mutiny, but due to his intelligence and education, was invited to join the mutineers and speak on their behalf as president of the delegates of the fleet, a nominal leader of the mutineers. Though he didn't exert much power as the leader, only ships bearing passes signed by Parker were allowed to pass through the blockade the mutineers constructed on the Thames. Captain Sir Rasmus Gower put together a flotilla of nearly 50 ships in order to protect London from the mutineers. Parker gathered the mutineers' demands and presented them to a government official, saying if their demands were not met within 54 hours, such steps by the fleet would be taken as will astonish their dear countrymen. As he was the one who presented the ultimatum, Parker was quickly vilified and presented as the face of the mutiny. The response to their demands was, all that could reasonably be expected by the seamen and marines has already been granted them. Their lordships cannot accede any further requests. Following this exchange, Parker ordered the mutineer fleet to withdraw, but no one sailed, and the mutiny collapsed. Parker was arrested, court-martialed for treason and piracy, and executed aboard HMS Sandwich on June 30th, 1797. Another unfortunate example of the nautical misfortune of a Richard Parker is in a work of fiction. Edgar Allan Poe is usually remembered for his haunting short stories, but he did complete one full-length novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. It was published in 2 volumes in 1838 and met with mixed reviews. The story followed the adventures of Arthur Gordon Pym after stowing away on a whaling ship called the Grampus. After a storm wrecks the ship, leaving only 4 survivors, the starving men draw lots to choose one to be killed and eaten to save the others from starvation. The unlucky sailor in the story that becomes the other sailor's meal is of course named Richard Parker. Poe himself said he thought the work was very silly, and some of his contemporaries thought it was too gruesome to be taken seriously. Other historians believe Poe's seagoing tale of adventure inspired the works of later authors such as Jules Verne and Herman Melville. Poe's story was an eerie portent for yet another unfortunate Richard Parker, this time a real cabin boy. On May 19, 1884, the yacht Mignonette left Southampton bound for Sydney, Australia. The crew consisted of Tom Dudley, the captain, 2 sailors, Edwin Stevens and Edmund Brooks, and a 17-year-old cabin boy named Richard Parker. The yacht, which some historians believe wasn't designed for ocean sailing, hit a strong wind near the Cape of Good Hope on July 5th. The yacht did not survive the storm, and Dudley ordered the crew into the lifeboat, which was only 13 feet long and inadequate for their survival. They managed to save only 2 cans of food and no fresh water from the doomed Mignonette. The first hurdle the men faced were man-eating sharks, which they fought off with their oars. Fortunately, they caught a turtle, which kept them fed for a time, but when it was gone, they began to starve. Richard Parker fell into a coma at some point in the weeks that followed, and the men killed him in order to consume his flesh to survive, though the sailor Brooks refused to eat Parker. This practice, though gruesome, has been called the custom of the sea, and a reality for shipwrecked sailors for centuries. Captain Dudley would later say, "I can assure you I shall never forget the sight of my 2 unfortunate companions over that ghastly meal. We were all like mad wolves who should get the most. And for men, fathers of children, to commit such a deed, we could not have our right reason." They were later rescued by a German ship, and honestly confessed what had happened when they reached port. The men were arrested, and the case Her Majesty the Queen versus Tom Dudley and Edwin Stevens created waves when it occurred. The public supported the sailors, believing that because the murder saved the other men, that they should not be prosecuted. At the time, the law had more protections for ship and property owners than common sailors. Dudley and Stevens were convicted of murder and sentenced to die, although that sentence was commuted to 6 months in prison. The case, well studied in law circles, though little recognized by the public, established a common law precedent that necessity was not a defense for murder. The character-imposed book, as well as his unfortunate namesake aboard the Mignonette, are said to have inspired Canadian author Jan Martel to name the 450-pound tiger in his 2001 Man Booker Award-winning novel The Life of Pi, Richard Parker. In the novel and the movie that followed, Richard Parker shares a lifeboat with a young boy named Pi after their ship is sunk. And in a twist on the previous Richard Parkers, Richard Parker the tiger eats another one of the survivors, and then Pi spends most of the rest of the narrative trying to avoid being eaten by the tiger. The two at first compete, but eventually they start to cooperate as each other's only companions for survival at sea. And the book brings a light on that question of law and harsh reality for sailors on the open sea. It also raises an interesting story about how spirituality can affect your perception of reality. But that character, Richard Parker, whom some argue is a metaphor for death itself, does seem to well represent the nautical misadventures of the other Richard Parkers. If you enjoyed this History Guy short, then feel free to click that like button, subscribe to our channel, and check us out on Patreon, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and our merchandise on teespring.com.